So let me first of all start off by explaining who Fathom are and what we do. So Fathom, we were formed out of the University of Bristol. So we actually formed when I was undertaking my PhD. And we're in the beginning, and we still are, a research-led organization. What does that mean? Well, we maintain really close ties with academia. So we team up with the University of Bristol and other research groups around the world. And we still publish everything that we do in world-leading journals. So everything that we do, you can read as much as you want into the details of the models and how they work. And hopefully that provides you with some transparency and a bit of faith that the models that we build and the data that we produce really are based on leading science. And in the beginning, that's what we set out to do, which was to bridge the gap between what was going on in universities and research centers and what was available to the commercial markets. Like I said, we were formed by a team of scientists when I was undertaking my PhD, and research has been really important to us. There's a whole bunch of papers you can read that outline the methodologies behind the models that I'm about to talk about. But I think one of the really amazing things is that we're now building flood models of the whole planet. We're building flood models that really are true hydrodynamic flood models covering the whole globe. So before I get into the global data, I thought I'd just outline quickly the other things that we have. So we have our global model. When we set out in the beginning, when we formed the company, the thing that we wanted to try and solve was to build global flood models. But since then, we've gone on to produce more bespoke models in other regions. We have a US model. A new version of that was released a couple of months ago. Some of you may have seen that in the press, because you can actually go and look at our US data if you'd like. It's on a website called Flood Factor. If you go to floodfactor.com, you can type in any address in America and it'll give you an indication of flood exposure at that property. So we're making flood hazard information, comprehensive flood hazard information, available to every American. And that's the first time that's happened. And we also very recently have released our first CAT model. So this will principally be interesting to the insurers amongst you. So what is it that we actually do? Well, Fathom was formed by a group of scientists who were principally involved with the development of two-dimensional flood models. And that's what you can see on your screen at the moment. I'm hoping it's not going to be too laggy, but it's an animation of a flood event that occurred in the UK. And the idea with this animation is to demonstrate the kinds of models that we can build when we have lots of data. And this is actually a model that we built around 10 years ago. And it's a really amazing model. So we have lots and lots of input data with which to build a model. We have great terrain data sets. We have measurements of the size of river channels. We know exactly where the rivers are. And we have things like river gauges on all of the rivers, so we know exactly how much water to pump into those channels. When you plug all those great data together, what you end up with is a really accurate model. So that this model is within error of the observations of a real world event. So that essentially means that it's as good as we can measure it to be. And that's really fantastic. And these models, when you give them loads of data, they're really accurate. And for that reason, they underpin a whole bunch of industries now. So across kind of risk mitigation, but through to engineering, insurance, of course, these models provide really valuable hazard information. However, the thing that we realized as researchers going back 6-7 years now was that actually when you move away from data-rich areas, building those kinds of flood models didn't just become difficult, it was actually impossible. We couldn't build models in data-poor areas. And we couldn't even build models at large scale. So the color scheme that you see on your screen at the moment, outlining the planet. So red is no national scale flood hazard information. Amber is partial coverage. And green is what we deem to be good coverage going back 5 years. So you can see for the vast majority of the planet, there was no flood hazard information available at any meaningful scale. And the reason for that is that these models are really difficult to build when you don't have lots of good data. So the question for us as scientists, again, going back to my PhD, which was many years ago now, was how do we move from small scale models to models that cover really large areas like countries or continents? Like, what do we have to do to enable that to happen. And we actually wrote down a list of things that we had to solve. Again, going back 6 or 7 years, this is the list we came up with. And these are the principal problems with building hydraulic models in data poor areas at global scales. By some distance, I would say the biggest problem is terrain data. If you want to build a good flood model, you have to have a good terrain map. It's really it's as simple as water flows downhill. So if you don't know where downhill is, then your flood model is going to be pretty cruddy. And unfortunately, we still don't have really high quality terrain data sets globally. So a lot of the time, especially going back a few years now, a lot of the time of hydraulic models and flood modelers was spent processing terrain data sets. The next thing is discharge estimation. So even in places like America, where we have somewhere around 10,000 river gauges, we still don't have gauge information, so measurements of river flow on every single river. And at global scales, the picture is really quite poor. We don't have anywhere near comprehensive coverage of river channels, of river discharge, sorry. So we need ways to estimate extreme flows. The next problem is river channels. So we don't, until recently, we didn't have a robust way of understanding even where rivers were, never mind how big they are. So representing river channels, both where they are and their size, has been a really difficult problem to try and solve from a modeling perspective. And the last 2 points are, I guess, perhaps somewhat boring, but critically important with flood modeling. The models have to be really efficient. We're solving some somewhat complex physics here in the models, and flooding is such a high resolution peril. It's very spatially complex, so you need to model it at high resolutions. And when you're solving those physics at high resolutions over large scales, it becomes computationally very difficult to do. So we have to have really efficient ways to do that. And the last point is really important, and that is that these models have to be somewhat automated if you want to have global coverage. If you want to build models, even at kind of the scale of the USA, you have to have some form of automation. Why is that? Well, building models manually takes a long time and a lot of resources. So the US government has been building kind of small scale manual models of the US, and where they exist, they are brilliant models, but they've spent upwards of $10 billion doing that, and they still don't have anywhere near comprehensive coverage of the US. So if you want comprehensive models globally, then automation is really important. And we actually solved those problems in version 1 of our global data. So we published a paper back in 2015 that outlined our method for solving each of those problems. And this paper outlines essentially what sat behind version 1 of Fathom's global data. But now we're releasing version 2, and version 2 really is another step forward in our ability to model flooding at large scales in data poor areas. So I just want to touch on a few of the points as to why that is, what's changed and what's improved. And one of the first things is terrain. So before I go on to global coverage and global terrain data sets, I just wanted to mention that we, alongside the global terrain data sets, Fathom-Global 2.0 has much better terrain data sets inserted where they're available. I'm talking principally about LiDAR data. So LiDAR data is laser altimetry data. It's the gold standard terrain data set when building flood models. Where we have it, we can build really great models. And our 2.0 global data has LiDAR in the US, UK, Japan, parts of Australia, and parts of Europe. And it makes a big difference. So I've just got some images of LiDAR here. This is in Japan. This is some of the LiDAR we have for, I believe this is on the outskirts of Tokyo. And when we have that LiDAR, we can build really nice models. And this is output from our global model. So the horizontal resolution is coarsened to fit into our global framework. But the underlying terrain data is LiDAR. So it has very high vertical accuracy. So the models we can build are really good. But unfortunately, for the majority of the planet, we don't have LiDAR data. So we are constrained to using globally available terrain data sets. And like I've said, the flood modeling community in particular has been involved in processing terrain data sets now for almost 20 years. And that is because still the best thing that we have for building global flood models is a version of SRTM, which is the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. So this was a radar-based terrain data set that was collected 20 years ago now. But it's riddled with errors. And if you use it, if you just use it kind of off the shelf, it's horrible for building flood models. And the reason for that is that it contains multiple sources of error. So this is the Mekong Delta, and those stripes that you can see are not real features. So they are features where the spacecraft actually slightly pitched and rolled in space. And aside from the instrumentation errors, it's a radar product. So what does that mean for flood models? Well, the radar bounces off the top of trees and it bounces off the top of buildings. So we have to have a way to remove all of those sources of error. But there's been a really concentrated effort to do this. And what you've just seen there, hopefully, is the transition to the latest global terrain data set that we have. It's a terrain data set called MERIT. It was led by the University of Tokyo. A few of our guys collaborated on the paper and on the work. And it is the best global terrain data set that we have now for building flood models. It's actually a fusion of a whole bunch of different data sets. So it's a fusion of a few different DMs and a bunch of other data sets that have been incorporated to remove some of those errors that I talked about. So the next big problem for us building global flood models is river channels. I think one of the things that we were surprised at when we formed the company going back 5 or 6 years was that there were models out there, that flood models that didn't actually represent river channels. And you don't need to be a scientist working in this space to know that representing river channels in flood models is critically important. That they act as the arteries that convey flood waves, that both inundation itself and also the draining of floodplains. It's critically important to represent river channels, both where they are and how big they are. And we have now a much better map of where rivers are around the world. Again, this is a piece of work led by the University of Tokyo. MERIT Hydro is a fusion, again, of a bunch of different data sets. So it uses OpenStreetMap, it uses Landsat imagery, and it uses DEM-derived river channels to come up with a much more robust map of where the world's rivers are. And I just wanted to highlight why this is important. So on the left, you have the previous, our previous channel array. So our previous mask of where all the rivers were in the world. It was based on something called hydrosheds, which again was based on SRTM. But actually, in this area, and this is outside of Bangkok, what we can see is that the Chao Phraya, which is the big river that feeds into Bangkok, has actually been placed in the wrong place. And that's because there's a very, very flat land area. So the pink indicates a big river, and the blue indicates channels with smaller upstream areas. And what we can see is that the Chao Phraya, again, has been placed in the wrong place. Why does that really matter? Well, that red circle that you can see beneath the Hydrosheds logo is an industrial estate that actually got inundated in 2011. And that's where Western Digital had half of their global shipments of hard drives. And some of you may be able to remember that the price of hard drives over the next few years kind of shot through the roof. And that was because this industrial estate got completely flooded, and they lost all those hard drives. So if we want to represent hazard and exposure at sites like that correctly, then of course we need to know where the rivers are. And what you see on the right is that MERIT gets these rivers absolutely bang on. Previously, we had to go in and kind of manually edit channel arrays. You have to go in and manually kind of draw out where the rivers are. That's really manually, that's a painstaking task. And you have no chance of doing that comprehensively for the whole planet. There are so many river channels in the world that it would take a very, very, very long time and a large resource to do that. So again, this needs to be automated, and MERIT Hydro is a great automated way for us to estimate where river channels are. But what about channel size? So we do now have robust ways of finding out where rivers are. But in flood models, we also need to know how big they are. If we want to convey water down these channels, then we need a way to estimate how big to make them. And the way we do this is that we link the size of channels to our estimates of river flow. And that's actually a really important aspect of these models. And I think it's a really good decision to do that, because actually we don't truthfully, at global scales, we don't have, and we won't have for a long time, really accurate ways of understanding and knowing extreme river flows. And there's no way for us in the near future to be able to measure the size of river channels. But actually, we can make these models robust by linking those two things together. We don't really, there are big biases and errors in, for sure, in estimates of extreme flows. And again, we can't measure the size of channels. But by linking those two things together, we can make these models behavioral and make them far more, make them behave like we expect them to behave. But version 1 of our model, the way we did this was to compute bathymetry in isolation. What does that actually mean? So we went into every single river channel cell in the model, estimated a bankful flow, so estimated the amount of river discharge going through the river at that point at bankful. And then we just back calculated using the Manning's equation. But what that means is that we're computing the cross-sectional size of the channel in every river cell in isolation. We thought that was a good decision, but actually subsequent testing shows us that that doesn't account for things like backwatering effects, doesn't account for what's going on downstream, and actually resulted in the model not behaving as it should sometimes, and the channels in some places being too small. So in the past few years, particularly led by the University of Bristol, we've been working on a novel dynamic channel solver. And this is essentially a pre-simulation that computes dynamically how big the channel needs to be to convey a certain return period of river flow. And this is something that has been accepted and hasn't been published yet, but if you keep an eye on our various channels, you'll see that we'll be publicizing this over the next couple of months. It's a really cool new piece of technology, I think, in our space. So what does all this actually look like? What does it really mean? So this is a particularly bad version or area for for version 1 of our global data. So this is somewhere in the middle of Argentina. It's a very flat area. It's very dry. And what we can see is that the terrain data are struggling a little. So there's quite a lot of noise that you can see, that kind of speckling. And lots of the small channels really don't seem to be that well defined. And when I move to the next slide, you'll see the merge into version 2 of our global data. And what we can see is that the terrain data look far more realistic in reality, and lots of those smaller channels are, the representation is far more realistic in the new version of our global data. So what actually constitutes global 2.0? So we have global coverage at 90-meter resolution. It's 10 return periods. So we run from a 1 in 5 to a 1 in 1,000 year event. The truth is, if there are parts of the world that people are interested in and they want different return periods, we can run the framework for whatever occurrence intervals that we want. We're simulating flooding on every single river, regardless of size. So from the smallest to the biggest of rivers. And we're currently covering fluvial and pluvial perils. So that's riverine flooding, when rivers fill up and overtop their banks, and pluvial, so flash flooding. We will be building coastal models as well globally, and that will likely be released at some point next year. And the last point, which I haven't included here because it hasn't really changed from version 1 of our data, and that is that we do try and model the influence of flood defenses, but we provide the data both defended and undefended. Again, a little look at some areas of the world. So this is a pretty difficult place to model. So this is the Amazon. This is Manaus in Brazil. Of course, there's lots of vegetation errors. I show this slide because a few of our team spent many years traveling to Brazil and carrying out research along the Amazon to try and correct some of the terrain data sets in this area. And this is an indication of some of our categorized data. So we can tailor these data to however clients kind of want it served up. We can partition it however you want. And this is from one of our insurance clients who use these data for underwriting purposes. So it's very easy to understand. We can even provide it on things like color scales. So underwriters can look at it and quite quickly come up with an understanding of hazard and exposure at any point. So I thought I'd kind of outline a few use cases as well. kind of put this stuff into context and show you how people are using it. So the World Bank licensed all of our global data. If you go onto any of the World Bank's tools, so Think Hazard is a tool that the World Bank have that outlines potential hazard for multiple perils all around the world. And all of the flood information behind Think Hazard is Fathom-Global 2.0. Insurance is I guess, something of an obvious consumer of our data, and insurers do indeed use our global data sets. They use it from things like underwriting through to exposure management. Then there's exposure management. So this is an image from one of our clients. They're a really large computer company. Some of you may be watching this webinar on one of their machines. And they use our data to look at potential exposure across their infrastructure. So the blue lines here are fiber optic lines, and the circles are data centers. And again, they use our data to understand which data centers may be exposed. They're actually quite novel in that they've also used our models to try and understand which data centers may be exposed at the same time. So using things like event sets that are typically only really used in CAT models by insurers. This is an indication of some data that we supplied recently to a really large engineering company. And it was used in Peru to try and screen some sites. So they are working on risk mitigation and resilience in Peru. And our data was used to look at which schools may be overly exposed. And so they send us a bunch of locations, and we can extract data from our layers to indicate which schools really may need some detailed modeling undertaken. And then there's client risk analytics. So our data, one of the great things about having such a wide range of return periods is that you can use those return periods in kind of a sensitivity analysis. So you can look at which areas of the world may be overly exposed if things like extreme flows were to increase in any significant way. And that's something that one of our clients does. So 427 use our data to look at potential changes or amplifications in hazard and exposure. And lastly, disaster response. So having all these layers already computed is great because we can access them really quickly. And this is something that we've done a few times now. So this was some event response work that we did. And this data was used by the GFDRR, so the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction. And they used our data in Mozambique. So these are footprints from Cyclone Idai. What we did here, pretty simple, but I guess a good indication of what you can do with these data. On the left, you have a somewhat speckly, noisy estimate of an event footprint that was taken by the Sentinel-1 satellite, which is a satellite it's a synthetic aperture radar satellite. And although it can see through clouds, it suffers with a whole bunch of errors, speckle. It's not very good in urban areas. But what we can do is we can use footprints like that to try and find out or pull an event from our catalog that looks similar. And that's what we did here. We merged them together very quickly. And these data were used then on the ground by emergency responders to try and coordinate the response. My last thing, I just wanted a little sneak preview that's probably going to be most interesting for the insurers out there. And that is that we are now building global catastrophe models. So we recently published a paper that outlines a method for moving from static hazard layers through to plausible events for the whole planet. And we are already licensing these models to some clients, and we will be rolling this out for any region of the world that's of interest. And at that point, I will hand it back to Gavin.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. It's a pretty comprehensive run through. And we've got some couple of questions coming in, which we'll go through into a minute. But really, you're probably looking at this data and say, okay, well, how do I take it from here? So firstly, we can arrange a detailed product review on a one-to-one basis to really understand your needs and requirements for the data and put our data in the context of those. The next really is if you want some sample data, you want to test and evaluate it, we've produced a data pack a number of different locations around the globe, and we just need you to sign a very short agreement for the data, and then we can provide you with that sample data pack and a product specification detailed document on the data, and allow you to use it and analyze it and put it into the context of your own environment and your own needs and requirements. In addition to that, we also have a number of things. Firstly, we've got all our research papers that Andy talked to you about, and I'm just sending you all a link to our papers through the chat, and that's a link on our website that effectively has all our papers. And what you can do is go there and search through all the papers that we publish, and certainly the papers that Andy referenced and showed you earlier are available there. So I think that's one of the key things around Fathom, is that we're very transparent around the science. We don't hide anything. There's both the science and the validation of the data we're very transparent around, and we'd like to spend time with our prospects and clients to really get into the science and talk to them about it, and really help you understand what goes into our models and data sets, but also by doing that really get a much better understanding of where it works and perhaps where it doesn't work quite so well, so you can really tailor your usage and understanding around that. Okay, and then the other thing is Fathom Insights. So these are a series of videos we've recorded that around our products and data sets, and I've just sent you another link to that through the chat. And that's around digging into some of the science behind both our US data set and our global data set. And there's a couple of other interesting videos on there talking about resolution of data. We quite often get asked by various people around, well, what's the resolution of your data? What's the highest resolution you can get to? It's a bit of a misnomer because resolution doesn't always equal accuracy. Some people have the wool pulled over their eyes a little bit around high accuracy or high resolution data. So we put a video on there to talk about that. So please look at those videos, have a look at the papers. And again, if you've got any questions, please come back to us and let us know. So the full data set is available. Okay, so we've got now on screen effectively a screenshot of the web page for our papers, and you'll be able to go to those. And okay, I think that's probably it, Andrew, unless you've got any other slides you're going to surprise me with.
Sorry.
I can get my own back and ask you the questions that we've received and put you on the spot with them. Okay, so thank you very much for those that have provided questions. Let's have a look at a couple of those. First of all, we have a question around do we have a coastal flood product? And I guess we have the US data that contains coastal flooding. And Andy, do you want to throw some light onto sort of what we're doing around coastal flooding on a global scale?
Yeah, sure. So like Gavin said, we have, I think, really great coastal data in the US. So our US coastal data covers multiple climate scenarios. And it's been a big collaborative work over the last 18 months, working with a whole bunch of researchers in the US. We have some coastal data for other parts of the world that's usually built for kind of bespoke projects. In terms of global coastal data, that is for sure on the roadmap. We're already in discussions with a few leading researchers in the UK around teaming up to essentially try and plug our hydraulic model frameworks into some global models, some global coastal models, and that should be completed next year. I can see Beatrice's comment about data in Spain as well. That's really great. Thank you. That's a really useful. So one of the things that we love to do is to try and validate our models, check how they do against local kind of high accuracy models, what we deem to be high accuracy models. So that'll be something really interesting for us to check out. So thanks for that.
Okay, so we talked about coastal, and again, in our US data, we have climate change projections. to 2050, and they're pretty unique as far as flood modeling is concerned, particularly in the US. Could you just share thoughts on climate change and global data sets and where things are moving forward on that?
Sure. So I just to outline my background. So I spent my PhD actually coupling climate models with flood models. So I think I've got a pretty good understanding of how to do that and the difficulties involved. And actually coupling climate models with flood models, even in really data-rich areas, is a really tricky and difficult thing to do. If you're beginning to try and plug climate models into global flood models, it's important to understand that you're kind of bolting on an additional layer of uncertainty onto an already pretty big area of uncertainty. So we always kind of try and find out what the appetite is for doing that, and whether it's the right thing to do. Often it's legislated for, so for things like World Bank projects, we absolutely have to do it, and we can do it. And we do it for specific projects, so we can take our existing model frameworks and try and integrate climate models in a sensible way. But in terms of off-the-shelf global climate change models, we haven't gone down that route. I'm not sure it's a sensible thing to do at the moment. It would be a very, very large undertaking as well. Finally, our US model. So we have done this in the US. So again, in the US, if you guys go on floodfactor.com, you'll see that we have data under multiple climate scenarios for the US. But that was a big piece of work involving Fathom and others, a whole bunch of leading researchers in the US. So it was a very large undertaking.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. One of the other questions we've had is, how do you deal with outdated LiDAR data?
I mean, in truth, outdated LiDAR data is on a global scale is kind of the least of our problems. The outdated LiDAR data will for sure be better than the best globally available terrain data sets. How do we deal with it? Well, it is very tricky. Often there's not a great deal we can do if it's outdated. We can flag it in the model. We can outline that the terrain data in that area are perhaps not as good as other areas. But again, even if the LiDAR data is outdated, it's likely going to be better than other globally available terrain data sets. It is a problem, of course. I mean, it's for sure, like if you think about merit and its origins being SRTM, that's something that's over a decade old, and particularly in some areas of the world. So I'm thinking about China in particular. We've had some insurance clients come back to us and say, well, this industrial estate is seemingly permanently underwater. Why is that? And actually what you see is that 10 or 20 years ago, it was rice fields, rice paddies, pretty much underwater, but the whole area has now been transformed dramatically. And that's something, in truth, that's really, really difficult to represent if we don't have updated and new terrain data sets. So it's just, unfortunately a caveat and a difficulty with these models.
Okay, thank you. Right, here's an interesting one from John. How do you define the events and correlation between basins? And what about clustering and antecedent conditions?
Good question. So I haven't really spoken about CAT modeling at all in this. So the hazard layers that we're kind of talking about here are hazard layers. So they don't tell us anything about realistic events. It's kind of like a 1 in 100 year event for entire regions, entire countries, the entire planet. But we do have CAT models, and we do have event sets, and we define events and correlations in different ways. So where we have gauges, we can base the correlations on river gauges. So our US CAT model uses the USGS gauge network to define spatial correlation between catchments. And we can use those spatial dependencies to then compute and sample from our hazard data to create event sets. So our US CAT model has over 500,000 realistic events in there. At global scales, we don't have gauges. So instead we use global rainfall runoff models to compute the spatial dependencies between catchments. Antecedent conditions actually, when we're talking about floods of these kinds of magnitudes, are really a marginal influence on the flooding itself. So research tells us that antecedent conditions really don't matter that much when we're defining events of these kinds of magnitudes.
Excellent. Okay. So one of the questions we quite often get asked is, how do we compare our maps, or how do our maps compare to the competitors? So yeah, it'd be good to get your thoughts on that, Andy.
At this point, we don't truthfully know very much. There was a comparison done a few years ago, version 1 of our data, but a lot of the data sets that we were compared against were kind of research in nature and not commercial. Often these data sets are quite, rightly or wrongly, are kind of tightly constrained and not easily accessible to kind of do science on. So the truth is that we don't really know how these data compare. I would imagine they'll be pretty different, because you have to bear in mind what we're trying to do here, and that is model flooding for the whole planet. And there's a whole bunch of decisions that we have to make in the modeling chain that will change the outcome, whether you use a rainfall runoff model or not, how you represent river channels, what kind of hydraulics are you using. All of those decisions will change the outcome of the model. I would think the models will differ somewhat. I'm hopeful over the next few years there will be a nice comparison work, so we can compare different models and try and define where they are different and why they're different. But at this point, we don't really know.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Tom said, how do I have to purchase the whole global data set, or can I be selective? So on that, although it is a global data set, you're able to come in and purchase a subset for a country, a particular country or a region. It really doesn't matter. We can cut the data to suit your requirements. So we're absolutely not precious around that. It's really just providing you the data that you need for that particular project or operation that you're running. Okay, another question from Blaz. What sources of precipitation are you using? Is it a uniform global set, or does it vary regionally?
So for the global data, it does vary regionally. So we pool together intensity, duration, frequency relationships for the pluvial model. What does that mean? So I should probably start off by saying that, so the fluvial component of the global data set and the pluvial component are two separate simulations. And the fluvial model is actually not driven by rainfall data at all. So that is a gauged-based method. So we published a paper back in 2015 that outlined a regionalized flood frequency analyses at the global scale. What does that mean? Well, instead of deriving the model with rainfall data, we actually derive relationships between catchment characteristics and extreme flows. And that's what's used to drive the global fluvial model. The pluvial model uses these intensity, duration, frequency relationships that are often kind of engineering type relationships used to define design levels for extreme rainfall. And they vary around the world. So we try to pool together all the IDF relationships that we can from different meteorological centers and different design standards around the world.
Okay, thank you. Right, Tarquin has asked a question. How often are the maps updated?
So really that depends on whether they're better or not. Like we're not in the business of updating for updating's sake and trying to sell something shiny and new if it's not actually any better. The reality is that we'll update the models when we have principally better input data. I think we're getting there now with regards to the modeling techniques. Like we know how to build good models. These models are now becoming increasingly data limited. What does that mean? Well, we know how to do it. We just don't have the right input data to make them better. So when better input data become available, that's when we'll update the model. Could be next year, could be in a few years' time. It really is dependent on whether it's worth updating.
Excellent. Okay. So I think that's pretty much all the questions we've had. And thank you to everyone for sending us those questions. It's always good to hear that you've been listening and want to know more. Put Andy on the spot as well. So that's always good to see. So thank you for all those. If you do have any last minute questions, please send them to us now before we wrap up. But I would just like to thank you for joining us. If you do need any more information, please contact me. My email's in the invite that you received at g.lewis@fathom.global. and we can respond to any inquiries you have. Andy, any last thoughts before you wrap up?
No, just thanks for joining, guys. There's some really useful comments there as well. So yeah, thanks very much. I hope everybody has a nice day and a nice evening wherever you are.